Welcome to France 24, special coverage of King Charles's state visit to France. This is his first trip to France as king, and it begins here in Paris. French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife Brigitte are waiting for their royal guests at the iconic Arc de Triomphe, and we will be bringing you the arrival ceremony in full. But first, let me introduce you to the three guests who will be providing insight and analysis of this event. First, we are going to start with Philip Turle, our international affairs editor, and he is at the Arc de Triomphe. Philip, we are all awaiting the King and Queen's arrival. Tell us what the atmosphere feels like there.
Well, first of all, they are due here in about 5 minutes from now. This is all regulated extremely carefully to almost a second. Emmanuel and Brigitte Macron are due here now to be 5 minutes earlier than King Charles and Camilla at the Arc de Triomphe, ready to welcome them. And a ceremony will be held to do that. There will be the national anthem, which will be sung, God Save the King, and also the Marseillaise, the French national anthem, as well, will be played. You can see just behind me there is the Republican Guard, which is also waiting to salute the King once he gets here. There will be a ceremony which will involve the lighting of the flame on the tomb of the unknown soldier and the laying of a wreath, and then a review of the troops, after which the red arrows and the Patrouille de France will fly over the Arc de Triomphe in unison with their red, white and blue smoke coming out of the back. That will then be followed by a descent of the Champs-Élysées in two different cars back to the Elysee Palace, where the King will hold a head-to-head meeting with Emmanuel Macron to discuss pressing issues, pressing international issues, probably the war in Ukraine, probably global warming, and I would imagine also the migrant question, which has affected relations between France and Britain over recent months. But also there will be a time for them to discuss Franco-British relations more generally. So that is what is happening this afternoon, but it doesn't just end there, because then King Charles will be taken to the Palace of Versailles, west of Paris, about 30 kilometers away, where there will be a dinner tonight in the Salon des Glaces, or the glass hallway, which is a magnificent room overlooking the gardens of Versailles. Versailles built by Louis XIV, the French King Louis XIV, in the 18th century, and to which King Charles has been invited tonight with Camilla for a state dinner.
And Philip, you will be acting as our guide during the ceremony, helping us understand what happens. I also want to welcome George Gross from London. He is a specialist in British monarchies and a visiting research fellow at King's College in London. Thank you for joining us for this event. I wanted to ask, while we await their arrival, this visit was originally supposed to happen 6 months ago, was delayed due to protests here in France. Do you think that delay has changed or impacted anything as far as this event or the relationship?
No, I think it's equally important. I think it's a chance to continue to build this important relationship between France and Britain. So it's vital that it was to happen. It obviously, as you pointed out, was postponed. The Queen made many visits to France, at least 5 formal state visits, and the 6th with the opening of the Channel Tunnel. So King Charles is continuing that tradition. He singled France out to be the first of his state visits. So it was crucial it was moved forward, or at least would take place as quickly as possible after. But it's a very important recess. And as has already been mentioned, that on the agenda of the things that will be discussed, we've got Volodymyr Zelensky and the UN making an important speech there. So there will be this shared battle, as it were, in support of Ukraine that this meeting today, particularly with the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, signifies. So very important stress and build those relations. But obviously sustainability will be another of those topics.
George, will be coming back to you over the next hour of this ceremony, but I want to last but never least introduce our correspondent in London, Benedict Pavio. Benedict, this really is a celebration of Franco-British ties, of common bonds. Can you tell us about how this visit is being reported in the UK?
Yes, so this rescheduled visit, long planned, many things to plan for a state visit, is very significant. And it comes at an interesting time, an important time, because you'll remember that several months ago we finally had an Anglo-French summit that was with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, who really has done his best to warm up the relationships because they were absolutely dire under Boris Johnson. They'd become very, very tense between these two allies. And so, yes, this state visit, his first after his coronation, along with his wife, Queen Camilla, is that of a head of state, but a very different role to that of the French president, because the head of state in the United Kingdom, this is a constitutional monarchy, so it is not for King Charles to be political. It is the Foreign Office and the government of the day that decides what state visits a monarch will make. It is significant that it's his first state visit since his coronation. And let's point out from the get-go, that this is a man who speaks fluent French, who is francophone but also francophile. And he shares both those qualities with, of course, his illustrious mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, who had been educated to speak fluent French. And of course, he has very big shoes to fill. Now, there is a very warm relationship between the two men, very much the portrayal of the French President Emmanuel Macron in the British press, and I think it's fair to say across the world, was that he had really judged the tone of his reaction to the death of the late monarch by saying, to us she was the Queen, to you she was your Queen, in a very respectful and affectionate way, which I think is fair to say, at the risk of a generalization, is one that is shared by many French people. There is indeed, I would say, being half French, half British, having lived in both countries and knowing both cultures really well, a surprise element here in the United Kingdom when they realize how not just the French media, but the French people are quite fascinated by the British monarchy. So it'll be a very busy schedule, but beneath the not overtly political, there will be a bilateral meeting, as Philip earlier on said. And let's remember that the role of this constitutional monarch is also to meet once a week the Prime Minister of the day. So he's political, but behind closed doors, in the sense that a monarch is here to give guidance to the Prime Minister of the day. It will be very interesting to see, for example, what toast King Charles gives tonight at the Château de Versailles, and also he will give a longish speech tomorrow, which we, of course, will broadcast on France 24. And he will be the first British monarch to address both the lower house and the upper house, so Parliament and the Senate. I've got some students coming past getting a little bit excited at seeing a reporter outside Buckingham Palace. Sorry if there was some shouting there. So he will be the first British monarch to address in French and English and to address the French Parliament. And that will be very interesting to see. And also the coverage which we will get here in the United Kingdom. A celebration of the bonds, the ties, political, economic, geopolitical and cultural, of course.
Benedict, thank you so much for that context from the UK. I just want to update our viewers right now what they are seeing. This is the motorcade of French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife, Brigitte. They are making their way down the famed Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe. That is where this arrival ceremony for King Charles and Queen Camilla will begin. Philip, I want to come back to you as Emmanuel Macron makes his way down to the Arc de Triomphe. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the current relationship is like between Macron and King Charles? What kind of affinity do they have for each other and shared interests?
Well, first of all, the relationship between Britain and France has always had highs and lows. Many people have quipped, and I've heard it several times in the past, that it's like an elderly couple who don't love each other but are obliged to live together because they can't get away from each other. And I think that France and Britain are a bit like that. We've had some not very good relationships between the two countries over the past few years, notably because of the debate over Brexit, and Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron did not get on very well together. I think that relationship with King Charles and with Rishi Sunak, the current British Prime Minister, has vastly improved. You have to remember that Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron are quite similar. They're both from well-off families. They both come from the banking sector. They're both the same age. So they have quite a lot in common. And there have been feelers put out by the British Prime Minister since he took office after the end of the very short term by Liz Truss just a year ago to try to work towards becoming a more integral part of the European Union, but without rejoining it. And there have been overtures towards that by the British Prime Minister, which have gone down very well here in France, I think. And it's no secret that Emmanuel Macron and Rishi Sunak see much more in common than, for example, either Boris Johnson or Liz Truss before that. And as far as King Charles is concerned, I think that there is a certain fascination on the part of Emmanuel Macron towards the man who's been waiting for over 70 years to become King of France, who has this vast experience on the diplomatic front with all the heads of state and government that he's met over the years as Prince Charles and as Prince of Wales, and all the experience that he's had, which could be of great use to Emmanuel Macron. So I'm sure that will also be one of the subjects of discussion when the two men meet a little bit later on today at the Elysee Palace. And it has to be said also, one final point, is that the discussions that take place between Emmanuel Macron and King Charles will remain confidential. There'll be no press statement at the end of it. There'll be no common press conference between the two men. So whatever Emmanuel Macron says and whatever King Charles says will remain confidential between those two leaders. So there will be a certain facility, I think, in those discussions with that knowledge in both of the men's minds that the discussions won't go any further than the four walls where they're talking.
Philip, we are now seeing the King and Queen's motorcade making its way down the Champs-Élysées as well. So this meeting between Emmanuel Macron and King Charles is imminent now. George, just to come back to you right ahead of this meeting, tell us a little bit more about the influence of the king politically, because both these men are heads of state, but in reality their roles inside their countries are very different. King Charles, what is his influence politically and with the British public?
Well, as has been pointed out, and you're absolutely right, it is very different. He's a constitutional monarch. I think here, where it really helps in meetings like this is where soft power comes into play. So in terms of healing or improving a relationship that has been mentioned, struggled under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, but there's been this sort of bromance with Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron. This is a chance to cement that further because of the ties that the king has with Macron in terms of COP21 with the climate summit and the success of the Paris Agreement. So I think this is a chance to cement it. And because the king in the UK stands in a sense of above politics, it's a great way that it's different from, say, a meeting if Rishi Sunak went, where of course he's the Prime Minister, but he's also the leader of the Conservative Party. Or just the other day, with Keir Starmer visiting France, he's representing, as leader of the opposition, he's also the head of the Labour Party. So the king is able to stand above the politics and represent Britain in that way. And I think that can be very helpful when you're building relationship here or re-cementing. I like the analogy that was given earlier of the old couple. So this is a really good opportunity for that. And because the monarch stands above that, the sort of day-to-day of politics, it helps cement those relations.
And are France and Britain still doing a lot of work post-Brexit to try to kind of heal the wounds that Brexit caused? Is there still a lot of work to be done there?
Oh, well, I think it's very clear the direction in which the government wanted to take state visits of the monarch. Of course, it was meant to be Francis the first one, but Charles ended up, the king went to Germany. So it's very clear the pivot of Sunak to try and heal relations and build them with France and Germany as key places for state visits. So there's clearly work to be done, but there's so much the governments do anyway together and work together. The countries work so closely together on Ukraine, on sustainability. There's so many shared issues. So there's much to build on, but much to continue to cement and heal.
And we are seeing the motorcade of King Charles and Queen Camilla approaching the Arc de Triomphe. So the two leaders, Emmanuel Macron and King Charles, will be meeting momentarily. We are going to listen in for a minute. And Philip, if you see something that you can help give us some context to and guide us through,
Well,
if you could pop in when you feel
now.
like you need to.
You know, they're arriving now, and you get off. I hope you're showing this. They're getting off and out of the car. Do you want me to come back on?
Philip, yes, we are all watching along with you there, the two leaders and their wives greeting each other, customary, the French double cheek kiss as well there. So, Philip, we're watching along with you. If there's something that you notice and that you think our viewers could use some more context to understand, yes, please jump in whenever you feel.
Yeah, this is like the culmination, maybe I think, of years and years of waiting by King Charles. Remember that France was one of the first countries that his mother visited when she became queen back in 1952, her first state visit here in 1957. She was very fond of France, came here on 5 state visits and all, the last one in 2014. So I think a feeling that King Charles is coming back to familiar territory, but it's pastures new for him because he's coming here in a totally different capacity and being met by a man he knows who is President Emmanuel Macron, but in totally different circumstances to the previous one. So a very symbolic moment here at the Arc de Triomphe, reserved for heads of state, a state visit, something that is very symbolic for not only the French but also the British. This is something that the French do very well, bringing in heads of state to all the pomp and circumstance of France that is now being shown around the world. And it's a great selling point for France as well when one is shown these images of, for example, King Charles arriving here in Paris.
Just to explain to our viewers what we're seeing here, the two leaders, Macron and King Charles, are reviewing the French troops here. And then we are, shortly after this, going to see the aerobatic teams of the two countries' air forces flying above the Arc de Triomphe, that's the Patrouille de France, and Britain's Red Arrows. Macron and King Charles are now walking to the Arc de Triomphe. They will be laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is located just under the Arc de Triomphe. And the purpose of this is said to mark the shared sacrifices of the past and an enduring legacy of cooperation.
Canon. Présentez. Hein? Monarch.
just heard the national anthems of the United Kingdom and France, followed by the fighter jets from both France and England flying over the Arc de Triomphe. It's the Patrouille de France and Britain's Red Arrows. Those are the acrobatic teams of the two countries' air forces. Now, Philip, I'm struck by the solemn moment and the emotional moment that we're seeing here. I mean, these are two countries that over the centuries have fought alongside each other, have fought against each other. What do you think of the decision to start this state visit with this type of event?
This is normal protocol that the visit will start with a visit to the Champs-Élysées and an honour of the fallen of the World Wars, the First World War and the Second World War, in which France and Britain fought alongside each other. And the thousands of troops who lost their lives during those conflicts. And Britain and France still have military links. They still are quite closely associated with each other when it comes to their military activities. There's a lot of cooperation which goes on between the two countries. As I said earlier on, they're both members of the United Nations Security Council, permanent members of it, and also both nuclear powers. So there is a lot of military cooperation between the two countries, and we've seen that today with this flyover by the Red Arrows and the Patrouille de France. So symbolism, I think, paying tribute to all of the soldiers, both French and British, who lost their lives during the two world wars, and the fact that whatever happens in Franco-British relations, this will always be something that will bring the two countries together. And the French Marseillaise, the French national anthem written by Roger de Lille, played twice, and the British national anthem, God Save the Queen, also played twice and sung, the words sung at the second performance. So a lot of symbolism to show that ties between Britain and France, whatever happens politically, whatever the country may think of each other at particular points, those relations will always be rock solid, whatever happens.
And George Gross in London, specialist in British monarchies. I wanted to get your reaction to this event so far, and it seems that you can really view the emotion on King Charles's face.
Yes, this is hugely significant for him after such a long period waiting for the job as king. I think I draw a parallel and an analogy with that of Edward VII. So we're going back to 1903, in advance of what would become the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain that led in a sense to them being allies in the First World War. And the importance there of a monarch going to Paris, going to France, post the then Boer War, and building relations, healing relations. And I think here you can see not only the emotion of a monarch doing this state visit to France for the first time. He's been many times as Prince of Wales, but now as monarch, there's clearly the emotion there, but also the emotion, of course, as has been referenced already, the shared sacrifice in the First and Second World War. It's impossible to not go to those places, to not experience when you're by the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, whether it's in the Arc de Triomphe, under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, or at Westminster Abbey in London, to feel that sense of emotion, those shared bonds of history. So a very important, very significant moment for the king.
Mm-hmm. And George, it is, of course, a big part of the role of a royal, of a monarch, to visit other countries, go on these types of state visits, utilize their soft power. But does King Charles have any sort of special affinity for France and French culture that you can tell us about?
Clearly, it's already been mentioned whether he has language skills. This was shown in Germany with a state visit with his German. We're told that we're going to have a speech in French as well, just like his mother. So there were shared holidays of his parents in France. He has been many, many times. He is quite, a bon vivant of food and an interest in wines. We know there's a trip to lined up to a biodynamic vineyard. So there are lots of things that the monarch is very keen on in terms of Anglo-French relations. And then, of course, one of the most important things for Charles, for so much of his life, the battle, the challenge of sustainability. And I think come back to that important Paris climate accord, that important meeting, and then agreement. So there's much that the monarch has ties with in terms of relations with France.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Philip, climate and environmentalism, this has been a pet project, a very important project for Emmanuel Macron here in France as well. So I imagine this is something that the two men bond over quite a bit.
Well, it's a funny thing that years ago, Prince Charles was mocked largely on British television for his position and views on global warming, and he was often described as a crank and someone who couldn't be taken seriously and laughed at because he was warning about the possible effects of global warming in the future. And all these years later, now that he's king, I think many people see him as someone who was a visionary back then, because there was something about what he said which now rings incredibly true today. And that's something also that Emmanuel Macron is keen to discuss with King Charles. That will take place in the discussions after the ceremony is over here. You can hear Amazing Grace being played in the background. So we're drawing towards the end of the ceremony here at the Arc de Triomphe. But certainly many issues that the two leaders can discuss. And even though Charles is king, we were talking a little bit earlier on about the soft power of the visit by a British monarch to French and all the symbolism that entails. But of course there will be messages that will be passed between King Charles and Emmanuel Macron. And I think one of the messages will be that more needs to be done to fight global warming, more needs to be done to be more environmentally friendly. And I think that call by King Charles will fall certainly on sympathetic ears when it comes to the French President Emmanuel Macron, even though Emmanuel Macron himself has been criticised in France for not doing enough when it comes to trying to fight global warming in general.
For our viewers who may have just tuned in the past few minutes, you are watching the beginning of the state visit of King Charles III to France. And this is the arrival ceremony that is taking place at the Arc de Triomphe here in Paris. And we are going to listen in to the ceremony a little bit more as it wraps up.
أن يسير على خطى والديه.
Philip, looking ahead now, we are going to see the presidential and royal couples head by car to the presidential palace shortly. They're going to parade down the Champs-Élysées. They will be holding a bilateral meeting at the palace. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's on the agenda there?
Well, that'll be to do with international issues, most likely. Of course, we don't know. We're not given an agenda about what the two men are going to talk about, but it's probably pretty common knowledge that the war in Ukraine will be on the agenda, European support for the Ukrainians as well, and global warming. We've talked a lot about that. That's going to be on the agenda too. Franco-British relations, the migrant crisis. Remember that there's been much criticism in Britain about the way France has been dealing with the migrant crisis, and criticism that French are not stopping these small boats from crossing the Channel and getting to the UK. I think that will be also one of the items on the agenda that King Charles will discuss with Emmanuel Macron. That visit due to last about an hour or so, and then later on this afternoon the royal couple will head west of Paris towards the Chateau de Versailles. It's about half an hour drive away, the Chateau of Versailles, which was the former home of French King Louis XIV, dating from the 18th century. And there will be a state dinner held there tonight. We've already got some details about what is going on at the state dinner, what the guests are going to be given to eat. First of all, they'll be sitting at a table that's 62 metres long and 1 metre 50 wide. There's going to be a concerto played by violins during the dinner. There will be lobster for starters, then chicken from Brest for the main course, and macarons with strawberry for the dessert. There will be no foie gras because that's something that King Charles does not want to eat, although it was a preferred dish of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. And all of this prepared by the star chef called Anne-Sophie Pic, who has been busy preparing this menu over the past few weeks, ready to hopefully satisfy the taste buds of both King Charles and Queen Camilla when they arrive at Versailles later on today.
And George, want to bring you back into the conversation here as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Emmanuel Macron is viewed in Britain and how this visit is being viewed by the British public?
I think as much as anything, this is about rebuilding ties. We saw that earlier with Rishi Sunak's visit to France. So there is this very real position, I think, that, or perception, that France is a pivotal country within the EU, within Europe, and it's very important for Britain to build or rebuild those ties that may or may not have been damaged, at least certainly in terms of the Boris Johnson Trust premiership, the perception that had been damaged or weakened. So this importance of rebuilding ties. So that's, I think, one thing. I think something else that we have not really talked about here, we talked a lot about soft power, and the ties between the two countries, but this is also being projected to the world. These are two world figures meeting at a place that is so familiar to the world, Paris. And it's very important we have a war on European soil, so it's not just about them talking about the war, it's about how this is broadcast to the world. And so there's a big message here to Russia, to China, to places that perhaps the West is concerned about, that these ties are very real. So it's an important one, not just between countries, but the perception in the world as well. And I think these images are palpable. You're seeing these two leaders meeting at a key center of Paris. That is bound to send a message to those countries that we wish to send a message to.
And Benedict, I believe that we have you back with us as well from London. Can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Excellent. Okay. I wanted to ask you, there's a general rule in the UK with politics and politicians that you shouldn't overshadow what the royals are doing. But there is a bit of political drama happening in the UK right now. So tell me, is this visit even leading the news there?
Yes, I mean, it is now that the King has arrived in France. I should just say that there's lots of communication from both the British side and also the French side. You've got President Macron, who, as King Charles was landing at the airport and being greeted by the French Prime Minister, King Charles left a prince and was returning a king. You then had King Charles saying how much he and his wife, Queen Camilla, were looking forward to their visit because they had such love and admiration for France. As for the political drama, you are
Okay, it appears we've lost Benedict's connection, unfortunately. Perhaps, George, would you be able to pick up there where Benedict was unfortunately cut off and tell us a little bit more about how the sort of two stories between the political side and politicians and the Prime Minister and how that is fighting for headlines with King Charles's visit?
Yes, this is on the basis of the Downing Street leak that revealed that Rishi Sunak is perhaps changing tack a little in terms of the climate ambitions of the government, and of course that's hit the headlines overnight, and that runs slightly at angles with King Charles meeting President Macron. We know sustainability is so much part of this visit, so it does somewhat run apart. From that, we of course waiting on more detail as to what the Prime Minister really intends to do. Some of that's been covered today, but firm detail exactly what he's going to row back on in terms of net zero and so on. It seems to be more about the pace rather than the overall concept. So that perhaps means that it doesn't change things too much for the King in discussions with President Macron, but clearly, it's an odd one. It wasn't deliberate because it was built off a leak, but Downing Street's decided to go ahead anyway.
George, I also wanted to ask you if you could, as an expert on the royals and the monarchy, tell us the things that you noticed differences between Queen Elizabeth's visits to France and this visit so far here.
Well, at the moment, for the state function, it's everything that we'd expect, as has already been mentioned. This is very typical. But King Charles made a big thing about wanting to get out and meet people and shake hands. So we're seeing a lot of that again here now in the footage, and that's part of his image clearly that he's putting forward. I think that not that the Queen was at all against it, but this big push, at least in what's been broadcast to be the meeting and even the menu. I think there was also mentioned that asparagus, which would have been on the menu in the spring, was now ruled off the menu because the King doesn't want to eat something that's out of season. So things like that I wonder whether the Queen would have been as public about suggesting. I mean, it's clear that the palace wants to say that message to go out, that sustainability is so important. So things like that. But broadly at the moment, I think you're seeing what you would expect of a state visit. With all the pomp and pageantry that one would be accustomed to.
And Benedict, I believe we do have you back by telephone. Is that correct? Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for getting back on the line with us. So we did have George follow up on the question that I was asking you, and we've been discussing the differences between the style of visit that the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, his mother, when she made state visits, and what we're seeing here with King Charles. I'm wondering if you could comment, as someone who has covered the royals for a long time, what's standing out to you as far as the stylistic differences between the two monarchs?
Well, of course, this is a man who has, as one of our other speakers was saying, waited all his life to become king. I think the fact that we see how moved he is, I thought it was very evident on the day of his coronation is. I think he is a man we know who is prone to showing much more, being much more expressive in his faith than his mother was, apart from at the very end of her life. But he is a man who takes everything that he does extremely seriously. He will want this to go as well as possible. He will want to be in service, and that was part of his oath very much on his coronation day, and to be seen doing his duty in the best possible way, of being helpful and reaching out. This is somebody who has repeatedly said how open he is to other cultures, other faiths. He has, as was also being pointed out, for years thought that organic farming was very important, that sustainable development was very important. Indeed, both President Macron and, I understand, King Charles will be meeting tomorrow financiers, entrepreneurs, businesses to help with that financing of sustainable development. And of course, when the king goes down to Bordeaux, he will be speaking to farmers. This is something he very much wants to do, to farmers who fought these terrible fires last summer in the southwest of France. I gather he's also going to go and replant a tree in the garden of the British embassy later. So all these symbols are very important. He's somebody who is very, very well read and is very sensitive to cultural diversity. So I think he will be at pains he will have done a lot of homework, as indeed his mother. He will have prepared this very carefully, as will his wife as well. She has a slightly, at times, separate program from her husband, the king, and she will be going with President Macron's wife, Brigitte Macron. And there's a special literary prize, Franco-British literary prize. That will be also a first after the successful Anglo-French summit back in the spring. So I think we're going to hear really how good the relationship is, how positive it is, how strong the historical but also current ties are, whether it is in matters of defence, and very much about the two peoples. And there is no doubt that the French love to come to the United Kingdom and are fascinated by British culture, not just the royal family, but all things British. And equally, it is true that British, thousands of people, for example, I understand, speaking to the British ambassador, Dame Mena Rawlings, the other day, and 40,000 British people live in the Bordeaux region. So this will be important to reach out to that community and to all communities, I think. And that will be very interesting to watch. And also to see tomorrow morning's coverage in the United Kingdom of this report. But if you were alluding to the fact that Rishi Sunak, there is some drama going on the political level, we know we're going to get a general election, or we believe we're going to get a general election in either spring of next year or autumn of next year. But there was a leak last night from something that Downing Street was considering, and that was very much to do with the environment, and possibly Downing Street and Rishi Sunak watering down key green targets on cars and on boilers here. And it reached such fever pitch that I understand that the British Prime Minister has called a press conference for 4:30 London time, 5:30 Paris time on this. Now, normally, that would not be a good idea, because that's going to split the coverage, of course, of the important state visit that has been a long time in the planning. What we haven't mentioned, I think, in our coverage is the rugby, because, of course, France is hosting the World Cup. There are 4 British teams, the Welsh, the Scottish, the English, and the Northern Ireland team in the Ireland team. And so that is something that's been followed closely here. And I understand some stars of rugby will be meeting, French and British will be meeting the King and President Macron later on at Versailles.
Benedict, thank you for all of that context, really interesting details there. Philip, I want to just point out we're seeing the King and Emmanuel Macron take a lot of time to walk down the Champs-Élysées, shaking a lot of hands, spending a lot of time with the public here. Can you just put a little bit of scale for us? I mean, how many people are there? Was anyone able to just come and catch a glimpse of the King if they wanted to? It's hard for us to tell from the TV images exactly how many people are there.
So what you're actually seeing is King Charles and Emmanuel Macron greeting people who've been invited to watch the ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe in different seating arrangements around the Place de l'Étoile, the square where the Arc de Triomphe is situated. So first of all, he was reviewing the troops, and he went round and was talking to the members from the Republican Guard, from the Paras, from the Marines, and then after that, they moved on to greet members of the French government. We saw the Interior Minister, the Justice Minister, all of those sitting in a government tribune who were presented to King Charles, and then moving on to meet staff from the British Embassy working in Paris, also in a different tribune. Once all of that has happened, then the King will get back into his car, the Bentley, and be driven down the Champs-Élysées, which is a fairly short drive, probably about a kilometre and a half towards the Elysee Palace, and that is where we'll see how many people have actually turned out to watch that motorcade go past. Back when Queen Elizabeth was Queen until her death, every time she came to Paris on those 5 state visits, there were crowds of people everywhere because she was someone who was very much endeared to the French people and in their hearts. So it's interesting, or will be interesting, to see how many people have actually turned out to see King Charles. I suspect there will be quite a few people there wanting to get a glimpse of the King in his car as he's driven past with Brigitte Macron. So that will be coming up in just a few minutes from now.
We are seeing King Charles and French President Emmanuel Macron back in the motorcade and making their way down the Champs-Élysées, along with many motorcycles and cars and horses as well. Quite the spectacle for those on the sidelines. And they are making their way to the Elysee Palace, the presidential palace, where they will be holding a bilateral meeting. I want to thank you all for tuning in for this special coverage, and of course to our reporters and guests, International Affairs Editor Philip Turrell, George Gross from London, a specialist in British monarchies, and our reporter in London, Benedict Pavio. We will have more news for you in just a few minutes, so do stay with us.